we know the Supreme Court is not deterred by the weather. And so friends of Cuba are not deterred by the weather. We're here today because the Supreme Court is hearing two important cases against Cuba. They're doing this on the down low. There's no headlines. There's no another attack on Cuba. There's nothing like that. It's just in the headlines on Associated Press and other news outlets that this is happening. Today we have reporters, people's reporters here who are going to tell the truth about what happened here today and the background of what we're doing. The program today is, we have 6 speakers. We're going to start off with people who have been to Cuba recently, who just came back to give us a first-hand report of their experiences there. Then we're going to have Blake Burdge, who is an author, and I forgot the name of his blog. Cuba Monitor. Everybody should look that up and follow it, because it is the reason he's here, because I saw the article that he did about this case. Then we're going to have Francesca from the Center for Economic and Policy Institute. We're going to have Basav, who's going to talk about Exxon a little bit, who's bringing the case in the afternoon. And the last speaker will be Leonardo Flores, who most of us know and remember back from the days when the Venezuelan embassy was in Georgetown and we were fighting to keep it in the hands of the Venezuelan people. My name is Cheryl Labash. I'm one of the co-chairs of the National Network on Cuba, and I'm very glad to be here today and moderating, actually not moderating, but sharing this or opening up this. Okay, so without further ado, let's hear from Paul Coates, who is the founder of Black Classic Press, and he has just returned from Cuba.
Good morning. So I walked in a few minutes ago, and Cheryl told me that this panel, or that this discussion was going to start, and I would be a part of the people kicking it off. And she asked me, did I feel okay? And I said, okay. And I came up, and she said, are you still okay? And I said, okay, well, you're going to start. And are you ready? And I'm about as ready as I can be, you know? So, first of all, I want to thank you, first of all, for providing this opportunity for me to speak, and to speak on the experience of our delegation. We had about 21 people, who went down to Cuba. We were initially going down to the book fair, something that as a publisher I'm very familiar with, and this would have been the 3rd time that I've traveled with a group of people. As many of you know, the book fair was canceled this year. It's one of the more important book fairs in the world, and it certainly is important to the Cuban people. People come from all over Cuba. They've had attendance as high as 1 million people, and over the last few years, very close to 1 million people traveled to that book fair. It's an event that extends out for about a month, and it provides an opportunity for young people, for elders, to gather together and just bathe themselves in the love of books. The fact that it was canceled this year had to do, of course, with the intensification of the aggression of the United States, and in particular the blocking of oil and fuel shipments into Cuba, which has affected the whole country and affected all people on all different levels. In terms of the book festival, the effect was that the Cubans could not organize the transportation that they normally organize to bring people in from the countryside. Although people travel from all over the world, it's really a festival for the Cuban people, a celebration for the Cuban people, and on all levels. And because they couldn't do that, and because they couldn't do that effectively, they decided, and I'm saying the wrong word because the Cubans correctly say that the book fair has been postponed, not canceled. They refused to accept cancellation in the face of the embargo and the blockade of oil. What they look at doing is actually carrying, and this is already planned, carrying the book festival, the book fair, into the community. They're going to break it down and carry it into the rural communities in small groups. So they look forward to that. That persistency, that refusal to be defined by the term of their refusal to accept defeat, such as a term like cancellation, I found to be empowering in itself. And it was a collective, in my experience, a collective expression of determination throughout people in Cuba. People are hurting. People are literally starving because the food supplies are, it's not only the food supply, there's still food in Cuba if you can pay for it. But so many people are without the money to pay for food that they're having a hard time. The last day I was there, I met a brother who was one of the assistant directors of the National Library. We had met him 2 previous times that I was there, and he just told me how hard and how difficult things were for him and his family. The fact that he had been without work for the last couple of months and without pay for the last couple of months, he did not have, as he was telling me, he didn't know where he would get food and money to take care of his family. I was able to leave him, money that I had, but that was temporary. His example was an example that I ran into a number of times. People who we went to visit, the celebrated filmmaker, for example, Leonardo, the celebrated writer, poet, who many of you probably know, Nancy Marino. These are people who are centers of activity, who've always been centers of activity in their community. They're suffering, and the community is suffering. However, what I found encouraging and persistent among people like Nancy and other communities that we stopped in and we visit is a collective spirit to share whatever they have. That shared among the community, among the Cuban people is enduring. We were able to carry down limited supplies. Our group went to the book, well, we intended to go to the book fair, but a month before going, it was postponed. So our group still went with the idea that we were going to carry down as many supplies as we could, which we did. We carried down different things, medical supplies to assist, food supplies to assist, and other things. Of course, it was limited. You're talking about 20 people, and that's what you carried possibly a suitcase apiece of aid. All of it, wherever we stopped and it was distributed, the people just appreciated it so much. In that sense, we were fulfilling, our delegation was all African American. We were fulfilling as African Americans on the historic commitment and the historic debt that we had to Cuba and the Cuban people. And this was a consistent thought that ran through our group. A consistent understanding, a consistent undergirding that ran through and supported our group. We're well aware as African people that Cuba has been at the forefront of support for Africa and for African Americans, always have been. We're well aware of the Cubans who died in Africa for the freedom of people of African descent. We're well aware that it is Cuba that has been the only source, I shouldn't say the only source, I should say the main source of support for African American struggle in this country. We're well aware that in the 50s when they wanted to lynch Robert Williams in North Carolina, he was able to go to Cuba. Cuba provided support for us, and we went with the understanding that we were there to provide support for Cuba. One of the questions that I've raised a number of times for our group was the question, what are you going to do when you get back? What do you do in support of Cuba when you get back? It wasn't a question that anyone was supposed to give me the answer to. It was a question that each person was supposed to consider for themselves. I want to tell you about a young lady who I knew, who was on that group tour with us. And I think she pondered that question. It was a sister, young sister that I've known for all of her life, actually. And many, many years ago, we used to go to demonstrations together. One of the things that I know that this young lady took on was to support Cuba in ways, in multiple ways, any way that she could figure. She's reached out to people and done things, and I know she will do more things. But I want to just highlight her in particular because she's my daughter. Okay? We used to go to demonstrations when she was a little girl, and there have been a number of years since then, decades, that we haven't gone to demonstrations. But our group was transformed. Her son, who is grown, was on that trip. He was transformed. I had another daughter on the trip. She was transformed, and her son was transformed. I want to tell you about and highlighting that one particular daughter because her transformation and her commitment to the Cuban people shows up today. She actually beat me here. Okay? That's my daughter, Kelly. But here's the thing. The deal is that our group, including me, were transformed. My understanding of Cuba and my commitment to Cuba expanded by talking to the Cuban people. And one of the things that they want is, of course, for more people to come, because the experience of Cuba is to experience Cuba is to be transformed by that. And so one of the things, one of the messages that I bring back is that people in this room don't need to be lectured to. Many of the people certainly have written about Cuba, know more about Cuba than what I do. But I still bring back the message that one of the things that we have to be committed to is getting people to Cuba. So I know we have an effort and literature in the back of the room to help do that. And I just celebrate the people who have been working very, very hard over the years and over the decades. And I'm going to close this out. I'm going to close this out with a point that goes with us going back to Cuba. You know what our group was bothered by? Our group was bothered, again, there are 20-some-odd people, and we were bothered about knowing that the resources were limited about going to Cuba eating the food that belonged to the Cuban people. You know, like, how do we do this? It was this moral conundrum. And one of the things that the groups who work with us encouraged us to understand is that the people actually that we were, the people who we would be serviced by when we were there were actually being employed. The money that we brought to Cuba, the little money as far as I'm concerned that we brought to Cuba, would help support those families. And it was that important. It was also important, as was made clear to us in asking people to come, that though our demonstration, our being there was a demonstration of solidarity with the Cuban people. And that's very, very important. And they are encouraged so much by that. So at this point, one of the things that I took on in answer to my question of what do you do is I took on lining up groups or people who would organize groups to go to Cuba. And I've been back about 2 days and I've got 2 different organizers so far. I got a few more days and I'm going to work on a few more organizers so that in my small way, and that's not the only thing I see doing, because there are tremendous opportunities for all of us to do things. And again, the people in this room are not the people I'm talking to. I'm actually talking about the people who know. We have tremendous capacity to organize those who are around us in specific ways. Because I think most people, forget the politics, set the politics aside. Most people can identify with the level of catastrophe that we're looking at. The level of catastrophe that affects people all throughout Cuba. 2 things I want to close on. One, I was going in this direction. I was talking about the place we stayed, one of the hotels we stayed in. I missed this until the last day, and we were discussing our experience. I missed the fact that it was a large hotel, we had clean sheets, clean linen, and everything was fine. But I missed the fact, and the 2 sisters who told me this, that downstairs in the laundry room, our laundry was actually being washed by hand. Because of course, you know, there was air conditioning in the hotels. You know, the Cubans went out of their way to make sure that the travelers were taken care of and comfortable. But actually the electricity run the washing machines and those things that they could save on, they didn't. Those items were being washed, and again, this had to do, these people were being employed, they were glad to be employed. What kind of world is this? You know, that people get joy out of working for the basic necessities, doing this kind of work. And where am I and where are we that we would even be comfortable with this? The last thing I wanted to share with you is the organizer on the ground there in Cuba for our trip shared on our last day. Now, she had been on point all the way through. On the last day, she was late. She was late coming. And she explained how they didn't have gas in the car. They didn't have gas in the motorbike, but she was able to get there. And then she went on to explain to the group how, just in a human way, how the fuel, the lack of fuel, was affecting her family and affecting others that she had 2 children who could not go to school because they didn't have, their uniforms weren't clean. And the uniforms weren't clean because they couldn't be washed in the washing machine, but also they could not be ironed. And so she was in this dilemma. She needed to get stuff clean, she needed to get to work, her husband needed to get to work, which her work was with us. And she was sharing that with us, and then she went on to share how even with the cooking, that they've been without power for the last week, 30 minutes a day of power, so they couldn't cook. And her cooking now was done on their veranda over charcoal. She was lucky. She was lucky. We, at least I'm convinced, this is not the world I want to live in without trying to change it. I know that most of the people that I know, most of the friends that I have, who I consider to be friends, will join me in that rejection of the current situation that the United States has imposed on Cuba. And I thank you for the few minutes. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Jaboa, who I almost had the opportunity to meet on Thursday evening at a wonderful fundraiser for material aid for Cuba, and we thank you.
Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Jaboa, and I was part of the African-Indigenous-Palestinian Solidarity Brigade in Cuba, part of the Venceremos Brigade. And I want to highlight the importance of the Solidarity Brigade. This was the first time that a group of African, Palestinian, Indigenous people intentionally gathered together to go to Cuba and to see how our interconnected fights were together. We met with Palestinian medical students from Gaza while in Cuba who were studying in Cuba. We attended events where we learned from freedom fighters about their time in places like Angola. We went to maroonages where we heard about how formerly enslaved Cubans found their own freedom together. And we really showed how not only our histories of interconnection are tied, but our current present is tied and our futures are tied. So I recently returned from spending time in Cuba last month. While in Cuba, I saw and experienced power blackouts and water pressure drops and shutoffs for 8 hours or more a day. I saw and experienced the degradation of public infrastructure, reduced access to life-saving material and medical aid, and reduced open days of schools and universities and food rationing. This is all a direct result of the U.S. blockade on Cuba and the daring stance that Cuba has to affirm their own sovereignty and self-determination and for their commitment to peace. The blockade and other policy punishments illegally imposed by the U.S. touches every part of everyday life for every Cuban. This includes extractive forces like Exxon who take from the collective good and privatize life-saving resources. I also saw how the Cuban people cared for each other. I saw how communities leapt into action when an elder was eating and he fainted. I saw how multiple cars had stopped and assisted a driver who needed help. I saw medical, labor, and education infrastructure built to support people. These actions seem simple, but the collective care is absent in individualistic cultures and natures such as the U.S. And these types of actions are seen as exceptional in places here, but they should be commonplace as they are in Cuba. Cuba shows us that despite the organized abandonment and imperial violence imposed on them, care for people over profit and investment in community over corporations is a true path of whole healthy nations. In the less than 2 months since I've returned, due to the escalation imposed by Trump's executive orders, killings of hundreds of people in Caribbean waters, illegal kidnapping of foreign officials, and threats to countries who provide aid to Cuban people, conditions have only become worse, with many calling the actions of the U.S. as genocidal for the 11 million people of Cuba. So, I'm here to reiterate a couple of demands. So, I have an immediate demand, and the Venceremos Brigade and many others have an immediate demand to end the illegal and genocidal blockade on Cuba. Since the 1960s, and for 66 years now, the U.S. has imposed an illegal blockade on Cuba and punished nations who support Cuban people by imposing material, economic, financial, commercial, legal, and relational restrictions. People in Cuba have suffocated by the blockade for generations, and yet they're still committed to each other and to build collective care. We met with a musician too while in Cuba, and one thing that he said sticks with me a lot. He says, "We do not give what is left, we give what we have." We also call for the removal of Cuba from the state-sponsored terrorism list. Oil corporations and the U.S. government know that their actions are unsubstantiated. Deeming Cuba as a state-sponsor of terror and a threat to national security is a political lie to justify repression and control. This control is not only at the cost of the Cuban people, but to all of us. The tactics of classifying working class and oppressed people as terrorists has been used to wage violence on Black organizers in the U.S., on Palestinian, Swana, and Muslim people globally, and indigenous people across the lands defending sovereignty. We also call for the passing of resolutions in solidarity with Cuba. Currently in the U.S., there are over 120 resolutions that have been passed, representing over 46 million Americans. Public support in the U.S. for Cuban people and the Cuban people's right to collective self-determination is only growing as people learn the truth and the impacts of imperialism. So I encourage everyone to encourage their city councils, county boards, state legislatures, labor councils, unions, worker cooperatives, all of these governing bodies to pass solidarity resolutions in solidarity with Cuba. So these declarations are truth-telling, and they are a step in normalizing relations between the U.S. and Cuba, and they are supportive of everyday people. Our fights must be interconnected. The fight for the Cuban people is the fight against corporations like Exxon, who bleed the life of people on Earth. The fight for the Cuban people is the fight to end imperialism and state repression everywhere. The fight for the Cuban people is the fight against authoritarianism, fascism, militarism, and occupation. It is the fight to free all political prisoners. It is the fight for healthcare, for education, for housing, for land, for families, and for the affirmation of our collective lives. So just as Cuba has stood for the world must stand for Cuba. We have a responsibility to and for each other, and our survival depends on it. So again, I affirm that we are demanding and asking an end to the blockade and to affirm Cuba's sovereignty, the removal of Cuba from the state-sponsored terrorism list, passing solidarity resolutions with Cuba, and to affirm people over profit and collective good and community over corporations. Thank you.
I want to thank the first two speakers because they pointed to something that is actually the purpose of this press conference. It's not only to protest the Supreme Court, although that's part of it, it's also to talk about what more we can do. Some of us have been involved in the Cuba Solidarity movement for a long time. And Cuba Solidarity has become routine for us. It can no longer be routine. There's millions of people out there, as Dr. Lake so rightly pointed out, who have passed resolutions, who have done, as a matter of fact, Washington, D.C. 2 years ago passed a resolution. But we can't sit on those things. We can't say, oh, we did that. The current situation says the time is now for us to find the people who are not already committed, convince them, get them to go to Cuba, find ways of raising money. And that's one of the reasons for the posters that are up here. There's an interesting international effort called the Flotilla, or now Convoy to Cuba, that is arriving in Cuba on March 21st. It's very close. They're raising money, they're encouraging organizations to group together and organize in their own area, to send a delegation to Cuba with material aid, to work on sending money for the generators and solar panels that can help alleviate some of the hardship that people in Cuba are facing because of the oil blockade that the U.S. has imposed on them, and the overall 60 years of blockades. I don't know if there were enough printed out, but there was the Mallory Rubottom memo that we had a few copies of, that April 6, 1960 really prescribed what the administration is doing now, and that has been done consistently over Democrat and Republican administrations to destroy the sovereignty of the people of Cuba. So I certainly encourage, there's bills before Congress. It's not presented this way, but those bills were actually drafted to completely undo the blockade. It's all the legislative stuff that we're going to hear about some of next. So there's the legislative end for people who don't live in D.C. and aren't disenfranchised that way. There is a week of actions coming up. It's sponsored by the National Network on Cuba's Action for Cuba committees. There's a caravan that's traveling throughout the East Coast and Midwest, gathering material aid, and there were some brochures on the back about that. So there are ways for everyone to figure out how to get involved, and if you can't figure it out, ask the people who've been involved in the Cuba Solidarity Movement for ideas and help, because we're here. We're here, we want to help, we want to expand, we want to have initiatives like this, where we see something. You know, you see on the bus, they say, or the plane, or the airport, see something, say something. Well, we put another spin on it. We saw that this was happening, and we said, we want to say something about it. So next, I'd like to introduce Blake Burdge. He came all the way from Boston, from Northeastern University, and he is an author, and he runs the Cuba Monitor.
Yes.
On Substack. So welcome. Thank you.
Well, hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Cheryl, for organizing this press conference. For those of us who have recently been in Cuba, to share firsthand experiences of the effects of U.S. sanctions and the blockade against Cuba, and for everybody present here in this uniquely dire moment for Cuba. Today, across the street, there's a couple of Supreme Court cases that are being heard for the first time ever under the Helms-Burton Act of 1996. And we are here to say something that is far too often avoided in Washington. The Helms-Burton Act is not some normal, neutral law, nor are these two cases routine litigation. The two cases before the Supreme Court today are a continuation of the political and economic assault the United States has waged on Cuba, and it is now being advanced through the U.S. judiciary. To understand what's happening today, we have to be honest about what Helms-Burton was designed to do. It was passed in 1996 under the Clinton administration at a moment of profound vulnerability for Cuba. This is just a few years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, meaning that Cuba had just recently lost its primary trade partner, its primary source of fuel, and its primary source of financial support. The island is in what we know now as the special period, an economic freefall marked by rolling blackouts, shortages, and hardship, which sounds far too familiar for what's happening today. The Helms-Burton Act was not written to resolve historical property disputes in Cuba. It was something that was written to finish the job. Helms-Burton did three critical things. First, it codified the U.S. embargo on Cuba into law, meaning that no future president had the flexibility to unilaterally lift the embargo on Cuba. Second, it explicitly created conditions for the normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba, on Cuba, dismantling its political and economic systems and adopting a U.S.-approved transition government, one that is pliable and is willing to do the bidding of United States interests. And third, through Title III, the particular statute under which the lawsuits to the Supreme Court today were brought, it threatened both U.S. and foreign companies with lawsuits for engaging in business with Cuba, explicitly to choke the island from investment and trade. That original intention matters today. Helms-Burton is one of the clearest examples in modern U.S. law of Congress asserting its authority over foreign policy in order to enforce regime change. It embeds political demands for a minority of voters in no more than a handful of congressional districts in Florida, whether it's economic restructuring or institutional reorganization or out-and-out regime change, directly into statute. This is not how international law works, and nor is it how a sovereign country, especially one much less powerful than the United States, deserves to be treated. For more than 20 years, presidents of both parties, Republicans and Democrats, from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush to Barack Obama, suspended this particular statute, Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, which is the statute which allows U.S. nationals to bring lawsuits against anybody doing business in stolen or expropriated property. They didn't do this out of sympathy for Cuba. They did it because they understood the consequences and the implications that activating Title III would have on the United States. It would internationalize the embargo, it would antagonize key U.S. trade allies, and it would turn U.S. courts into weapons of economic coercion. That restraint ended in 2019. Under the first Trump administration, Title III was revived as part of the administration's maximum pressure campaign against Cuba, alongside a new round of sanctions, new financial restrictions, travel restrictions, and an extensive financial blacklist of who you can and cannot do business as an American with Cuba. This was not an isolated decision. It's a deliberate effort to collapse Cuba's economy by any means available. This time it's just lawfare. Today, corporations like Exxon and massively wealthy individuals are asking the Supreme Court to go even further. They're asking the Supreme Court to strip Cuban entities of sovereign immunity, meaning that a Cuban company can be sued by U.S. domestic torts. They're asking the Supreme Court to dramatically expand the definition of what is considered trafficking in stolen property. And they're looking to expose anybody engaging in ordinary commercial activity to massive liability. In one of the cases being heard today, the tune of nearly $500 million. If the court agrees, it will be enforcing a regime change blueprint that was written over half a century ago. The people who will pay for this decision are not the corporations or the individuals on the wrong side of the lawsuit. It won't be the political leaders in Havana, the hardliners in Miami so desperately want to punish. It will be the ordinary Cuban people. This is amidst a backdrop of Cubans already facing fuel, food, and medicine shortages, who struggle daily, who are living under conditions made markedly worse by this economic pressure campaign by the U.S. This is the core truth that must be said plainly. Economic warfare is not some abstract idea, and sanctions don't land on paper. They land squarely on ordinary people. For more than 60 years, the United States policy toward Cuba has been animated by the belief that with enough pain, enough pressure, and enough isolation, they can force political surrender. And that belief has failed repeatedly. It failed in the 1960s, it failed in the 1990s, and despite however much pressure and pain the United States is bringing today, it is failing today. Instead of rethinking a strategy that has produced hardship, Washington is asking that its own judiciary intensifies it. The assault on Cuba has taken many forms: an embargo, sanctions, a financial blockade, and now a literal naval blockade of oil and diplomatic isolation. Today, it could arrive, depending on the decision, in judicial robes. The questions before the Supreme Court in both of these cases may appear narrow in scope, but the implications are enormous. Will U.S. courts become a tool for economic siege? Will domestic law be used to punish third countries like Mexico looking to work with Cuba or engage in humanitarian commerce? Will regime change legislation be given a new life under this guise of statutory interpretation? Everybody here in this room today is here to say that this must stop. Stopping the assault on Cuba means rejecting the idea that collective punishment is a legitimate foreign policy tool. It means recognizing that sovereignty is not conditional on political obedience, and it means refusing to let U.S. courts be used to escalate an economic war that has already gone on for far too long. The future of U.S.-Cuba relations and the United States policy toward Cuba should not be decided by the corporations or by the massively wealthy heirs to fortunes, how much they can extract from the largest damages award in a federal courtroom. It should be decided by whether we are finally willing to abandon a failed policy and choose diplomacy, engagement, and just the slightest bit of humanity. That's why we're here today, and that's why we say clearly and unequivocally, stop the assault on Cuba. Thank you.
Let Cuba live.
Let Cuba live.
Okay, next we're going to hear from Francesca Emanuele from the center.
Thank you, everyone. I would prefer not to be standing here to talk about lawsuits against Cuba. Honestly, I would prefer not to be talking about Exxon, for example, one of the wealthiest oil companies in the world that has harmed this planet, suing a country that currently is under siege. But yeah, we have to take this opportunity because a lot of the media is not paying enough attention of what's going on in Cuba, an island that more than 60 years ago decided that Exxon should no longer operate in its country because it did not comply with the new national policies its people and its government have chosen. And it's the right of any sovereign nation to do so. But I was saying, we have this opportunity because there is this law, this act, the Helms-Burton Act, that passed in 1996, that is being used for this administration to continue to attack the sovereignty of Cuba. This law, and it's very important, is part of the most prolonged and comprehensive economic sanctions regime still in force anywhere in the world, in our history. And I want to mention it because it is urgent for us to talk about it, because this sanctions regime has intensified over the past year and now constitute, without any doubt, a full-fledged blockade. A blockade that is pushing Cuba, as the Secretary General warned a couple of weeks ago, to a humanitarian collapse. A humanitarian collapse that where public transportation has largely ceased, where schools and most workplaces have been suspended, and many of them are functioning online when they can get access because of the blackouts. And that is affecting water and sanitation systems, which depend on electricity. And where food refrigeration, and this is very important, it was mentioned here, has been completely affected. People are seeing their food rotten because they don't have access to electricity. This is increasing the risk of acute food insecurity across the island. And this is not rhetoric, or I'm not exaggerating. It's being recognized even by the mainstream media. A couple days ago, the New York Times called it a blockade, a term that the mainstream media has been avoiding for decades. The New York Times, in that article, also reported that the U.S. intercepted a Colombian vessel very close to Cuba that was bringing oil to Cuba. This, honestly, I've been trying to find any law that gives authority to the U.S. to do so, and I haven't found it. This is illegal. The blockade is also an act of war. A few weeks ago, Secretary of State Marco Rubio acknowledged it during a hearing in the Senate. he said a blockade is an act of war. And I want to say that this administration is complicit now in a situation that could put the face of Marco Rubio and the President Trump of an induced humanitarian crisis. Ones that, by the way, could trigger a new migration crisis across the region, which supposedly, according to this administration, is one of the goals of this administration, to stop migration here, but they are inducing it. We therefore have a responsibility, we humanitarian and human rights organizations, together with foreign policy community, and indeed anyone who cares about dignity and justice, have an ethical and professional obligation to denounce policies that by design restrict the civilian population's access to essential goods such as electricity, food, and medicine. I speak today as an analyst of a think tank based here in Washington, D.C., and I must be clear. The policies imposed by the United States are not abstract instruments. They are measures that deliberately constrict a civilian population's access to essentials of life. Remaining silent in the face of this reality does more than betray the people affected. It betrays the very principles our institutions claim to defend. And we cannot speak about human rights or sovereignty or independence while this country is enforcing policies rooted in 19th century forms of domination. So the era of deciding other nations' future from afar must be over, and we must to continue pushing for that to be over, because clearly this administration is not aligned with that position. Thank you.
Next speaker is Basav from the Institute for Policy Studies, Climate Project Director.
Good afternoon.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about Exxon and what moral legitimacy they have to take Cuba to court. Spoiler, none. It is well known by now that Exxon's in-house scientists were among the first in the world to study the impacts of climate change before much of academia caught on. They found, unsurprisingly, that continuing to burn oil and gas would threaten the very future of human civilization. So what did they do? Did they shout the results from the rooftops and begin plans to transition Exxon's business away from oil and gas? No, they did exactly the opposite. They buried the scientific results. They spent money on misinformation campaigns to convince the public that the threat of climate change was either not real or greatly exaggerated, and they doubled down on their model of expanding oil and gas production. This is the company that now claims the right to take Cuba to court for alleged expropriation. Because of Exxon's greed, millions of people worldwide have faced and are facing wildfires, extreme heat, storms, flooding, and drought. Millions of people worldwide have died and will continue to die and lose their homes and lose their livelihoods for the sake of Exxon's profits. And this is the corporation that today regards itself as having the right to take a sovereign country to court for daring to stand up for the economic interests of their own people against the so-called rights of a corporation to make as much profit as possible by any means possible. And in this context, it is important to say that just this morning, the Supreme Court has issued a very specific ruling, which is that they will hear a case where Exxon and other oil companies are going to argue that they should be immune from lawsuits brought by state and local governments to compensate their states and their cities for climate damage. Here is a corporation and an industry that wants to be immune from lawsuits for the harm that they are doing while they are taking other people to court for alleged harm. Clearly, this legal system was not designed to work for us. It was not designed to work in the public interest, in the interests of millions of people in this country and across the world. It was designed to work for corporate power. And I know I'm preaching to the converted by saying this in this room, but for the sake of a wider audience on the live stream, I will say this. The law and the courts will not save us. We need to organize to save ourselves in this country, and we need to work in solidarity with people worldwide to save ourselves from the greed of corporations such as Exxon and a system of government that puts their interests over the interests of the vast majority of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Basav. Our final speaker, before we open the floor for discussion and questions, is Leonardo Flores.
That's right. Thank you so much, Cheryl, for organizing this. Thank you for who came out, especially those who traveled from Boston or Baltimore, like our friends from the Power Assembly. Cheryl asked me to speak a little bit about Exxon and Venezuela, because what Exxon is doing in Cuba is part of a greater pattern of interference in Latin America. It's part and parcel of U.S. imperialism.
Leonardo, you might want to raise the mic.
Is that better? Excellent. Okay. So there's a dispute over this region called Essequibo that's between Venezuela and Guyana, and that dates back to the colonial era. Right now, Exxon is inflaming tensions in the region in a bid to pressure the Venezuelan government and to contribute to its regime change efforts there. When Venezuela changed its oil law in 2006, Exxon decided to pull out of the country instead of accepting a minority role in its shared joint projects with the state oil company PDVSA. Instead of accepting this role, they decided to sue Venezuela for over $16 billion. And they did win an award, but it was less than 10% of that, and that was awarded by the International Center for Settlement of Investor Disputes. And it was considered a victory for Venezuela and a slap to the face of Chevron for the audacity in carrying out this ridiculous lawsuit against Venezuela. It's very similar to the lawsuit that we're seeing right now against Cuba. Since that time, Exxon has gone to extreme lengths to try to destabilize Venezuela. In fact, Trump's first Secretary of State in his first term, he was Rex Tillerson. Rex Tillerson came directly to the State Department from his role as the CEO of Exxon. Rex Tillerson was then the very first person in the United States government to say that the United States should support a military coup against Venezuela. He was one of the first Trump administration officials to say that Venezuela should come under U.S. military attack. And as the U.S. pressure has mounted on Venezuela, Exxon has attempted to militarize the dispute with Guyana. So they routinely accuse Venezuelan ships of coming too close to their own ships. But the thing is that the Exxon ships are operating in disputed waters, and there's been many examples of those same ships that are exploring for oil coming into Venezuelan waters that are not even disputed. In fact, Venezuela and Guyana, despite having this conflict that goes back it's not even a conflict, it's a dispute that goes back 60 plus years, there's been an agreement. It's called the Geneva Agreement, and the dispute was supposed to be settled under the auspices of that agreement. But right now, Guyana sent this dispute to the International Court of Justice. Do you know who paid for Guyana's lawyers there? Do you know who paid to have them change the Geneva Agreement and drop it so that they could inspect the ICJ? It was Exxon Mobil. They paid for these lawyers, and it wasn't generosity by Exxon. It's protecting their interests in Guyana. And an analysis conducted by Global Witness found that, this is a quote, that Exxon used aggressive tactics and threats to pressure inexperienced Guyanese officials to sign a deal. And this deal gives Guyana a lower profit share than the industry standard, and it says that it's costing Guyana $55 billion. So that's an extra $55 billion going to Exxon because they were able to manipulate the Guyanese government into signing a deal that's not in their favor. On top of that, Exxon routinely overstates the cost of their production in Guyanese oil fields, saying that it costs them $40 to produce the oil per barrel, when in fact it's more around $25, $28. That's even more money that they're stealing from the people of Guyana. So when we look at what Exxon is doing, not just to the people of Guyana, to Venezuela, to Cuba, we have to really understand it in the context of the Monroe Doctrine, in the context of imperialism, right? Because the US is aiming for geopolitical control over the entire hemisphere. And the point of this control is not just to say that, oh, look, now Venezuela is an alleged protectorate country. It's to control the actual resources to the benefit of US corporations that always put profits over people. So what can we do in the face of this? And I want to bring this back to Cuba because that's why we're here today. What can we do in the face of this? And I'm so glad that Cheryl and Paul and Dr. Lake and everyone else spoke about the importance really of political education, of talking constantly about Cuba, of demystifying and bringing, telling the truth about Cuba and erasing some of these lies that we see in the mainstream media, right? And pushing back against very simple claims, like the claim, for example, that Cuba is in a humanitarian crisis. It's not a humanitarian crisis in Cuba, it's a crime against humanity. They're very different things. But a humanitarian crisis might be because of a natural disaster or a civil conflict. Nothing of the sort is happening in Cuba. Cuba is being suffocated, and they're very openly saying that. In Congress right now, they have a bloc from the Republican Party based in Florida that is using the slogan, no oil, no travel, no oxygen. No oxygen for the Cuban people. They're openly saying that, oh, well, if Cuban mothers have to suffer and see their children die, well, so be it, because we need change in Cuba. Now, what's this change that they want to see in Cuba? You know, whenever these Gusanos talk, I'm always reminded of a very famous scene in The Godfather Part 2, where you have a bunch of mafiosos sitting around with a cake shaped like Cuba, and they're cutting into the cake as they talk about which parts of Cuba they're going to control. And right before that, there's also a scene where the mafiosos are in a big boardroom with Batista or one of Batista's people, and also present in the boardroom are representatives from U.S. corporations. Because that's what they want for Cuba. They want to recolonize Cuba and control it and make it a playground for the rich of the United States at the expense of the poor and working class of Cuba, at the expense of the Cuban people. And so when we fight back, how can we fight back in addition to political education? Well, right now, there's these two bills that Cheryl mentioned. Can't quite see the numbers from here, but there's a House bill and a Senate bill. And there's sister bills that are aimed to ending the Cuba blockade. So if you're listening from home, take 15 minutes today to call your representative and call your two senators and push them to support HR
7521
HR 7521 and
136
and S136. And also, really importantly, the other thing we can do is provide material aid. You know, Cheryl mentioned this great fundraiser that happened here in DC on Thursday. I wasn't able to go. I'm part of Code Pink, and we are participating in the global convoy for Cuba. And you can go to codepink.org/Cuba26 to see how you can participate in that. Because we're encouraging people to travel to Cuba. And as Paul said, it's not only transformative for you personally, but it gives direct aid to the Cuban people. On top of that, there are organizations like Not Just Tourists that where if you tell them that you're going to Cuba, they will give you a suitcase full of medical supplies for free, and they will coordinate the delivery of that suitcase in Cuba so that you can bring aid to the Cuban people. And I think that's incredibly important at this time. And I think Material aid is the one way that we as citizens of the United States, who are very much disenfranchised because we cannot live in a democracy. But that's the best thing we can do right now to help the Cuban people. Thank you.
That's all I had.
Good.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I wanted to ask a question about, and I don't know who can answer this, and just perfectly, sometimes the global South countries inherit economic structures that they inherit them, and it's hard to believe. So, and oil is one of them, the global dependence on oil. And I was wondering, but we also know that both Venezuela and Cuba have projects that they're engaged in that are meant to address climate change and weaning off of fossil fuels. I think it's apropos to ask if anyone knows any and can explain or describe some of those in this time of when oil has become the center point for this increased blockade.
I can start a little bit about Cuba. I don't know much about what Venezuela is in this regard, but when I was in Cuba, the only time
You may want to take the mic.
Oh, sorry, okay.
Yeah.
I can speak a little bit to the situation in Cuba. I cannot address Venezuela, hopefully one of the other speakers can. The only time I've been to Cuba, which was 6 years ago, I spoke with some people there who actually work in the Ministry of the Environment there. And what they said was that they were starting to, and in fact had already for some time been developing more renewable energy in Cuba. But going directly to your question, the two big obstacles that they faced, one was intellectual property, because a lot of the patents for solar energy, wind energy, battery storage systems, etc., are held by corporations in the global north, and therefore that makes the technology very expensive. Even though if you look at the actual materials, I mean, it is still expensive, it's still a big initial investment, but not as much. So the fact that you're paying for the intellectual property of big global north corporations prices a lot of these life-saving technologies, as we know, out of reach of people in the global south, and I know that to be very true about Cuba.
So can I do a follow-up while you're, a follow-up to that? Yeah, because I see there's a campaign here that I saw online also about sending solar generators and panels to Cuban hospitals, and my impression was that China was doing a lot to help Cuba with these materials because they are the largest manufacturer of these types of materials. They're a leader in solar energy. So isn't China able to circumvent those patents and those things you were just talking about?
Chinese corporations have their own patents on some of this technology, and that's part of the dispute between the US and China, because the US claims that China has stolen the technology, etc. But clearly, as the holders of that intellectual property, China can make the choice to make the technology available for much cheaper.
Okay.
And actually, I want.
While I was in Cuba, I just want to uplift what Cuban people were asking for too, and I appreciate this question. And I want to go back to the importance of infrastructure. Written material aid is something that every single person that goes to Cuba is charged with, bring as much material aid as possible, whether that's Tylenol, sometimes gardening materials, building materials, books. These are important and life-saving things in the moment, but there are attacks on Cuba's infrastructure is what is causing mass genocide and mass death on the island. That is something why, that is why there are these calls for global solidarity. Solidarity in the Caribbean, solidarity with Africa, solidarity with Asia, solidarity with all oppressed people across the world, because that is what is going to bring the infrastructure needed for Cuba to maintain sovereignty while continuing to be attacked. One of the greatest things that the U.S. is doing right now is punishing everybody else that's supporting Cuba that want to help build that infrastructure. So bringing solar panels is one essential thing in building the infrastructure that is needed. Bringing material aid is a band-aid fix that is essential in keeping people alive day to day. But I wanted to emphasize the ask of the Cuban people is to maintain sovereignty through self-determination, through infrastructure and aid, and to actually build infrastructure and not just the band-aid fixes of material aid that are essential.
I want to say a little bit about that. Tarea Vida is Cuba's 100-year plan. There's a really great video that was done by Helen Yaffe. If you haven't seen it, look at it. It has an interview with somebody who is involved in solar in Cuba. But what's happening right now is China is bringing a lot of assistance in solar. And there are solar farms that are being constructed. Solar panels are being put on the homes of the retirees that have really contributed to the growth of the country over the years, to make sure that there are areas, community solar, places where it's not individualized like it is here in the United States, where, well, I've got mine and, the heck with you. These are oriented to community facilities, to hospitals. And one of the things that the solar generation fundraising campaign reported on Sunday on the flotilla, or it's now a convoy, conference call, was that it costs between $20,000 and $30,000 to provide the whole solar outfit for a hospital or a clinic. So that's why it's important to have collective fundraising campaigns that can help with that. From the United States, we cannot buy solar panels and export them to Cuba. And there are, working together with the Solidarity Movement in Mexico, there are avenues of opening up where that fundraising can be, and these solar panels can be delivered to Cuba for the solar facilities.
Yeah. So adding to what Cheryl said, currently the government of Cuba has a project nationwide that is aiming to have 30% of their energy needs by renewable sources. And of course, the project is looking for 2013 to finalize 30% of their energy needs by renewable sources. The problem is that we have this blockade, and they have a partnership with China, Cheryl was mentioning, but of course it would accelerate if you didn't have this blockade. And the goal of the government is to reduce the dependency they have right now on oil sources, because as you can see, the US can impose this oil blockade and really push everyone to the brink.
I'm Kathy Boylan, and I'm with the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker. Catholic Worker started in 1933 by a woman named Dorothy Day, a man named Peter Morin. But her main focus was refusing to pay federal taxes, because our taxes, right now, we know they're funding everything that's happening in Cuba. They're funding the crime of genocide, the crime against humanity that is Venezuela and whatever. We've been paying for it. She could say, we've been paying for it all along. So when we talk about material aid, my proposal is that people, if you have to pay money to the government where there's no democracy here, but we're still paying the money to keep the non-democracy going, we should refuse and take whatever money we think we owe and send it to Cuba, or send it to Gaza, or send it to someplace else, a public school, or whatever. But we cannot continue to fund the insane, the violent, this government is beyond, we've got to be so worried, and our money is paying for it. We're all responsible. We're all complicit if we pay any money to the federal government. So, on March 6th at Dorothy Day House, we have an example. A man coming to us first he refused to go to Vietnam, and all his life, and now he's 70-something, has refused to pay any money to the federal government. And he's coming to answer any questions, any whatever. We're in D.C. I have flyers. I don't know if you want to answer, but it's a crime, I guess, to pay, but it's a crime to pay.
I'm really sorry, these are questions.
Yeah, I know, it's hard to ask you a question where you have to answer that might be illegal. It's illegal, so I'm putting you on the spot. But I'm saying, I don't want to put you on the spot. I want to say, we cannot give money to the federal government of the United States.
Right on.
Okay. Hi, David Montgomery from The Nation. I have a question about the Cuba solidarity movement in this country. Has been active and hardworking and committed for many years, you could say decades. And I just wonder if some of you would have any reflection, personal or just your own objective observations, whether this now is different, feels different for the movement, if you're already getting signs that the movement is breaking out to folks who may not have been involved before. Cheryl very helpfully pointed out all the different flotillas and convoys and fundraisers and meetings. What else would you say about how, if you think now is different, and if you're seeing signs that it's breaking out and could make a difference?
I can't answer your question directly because I don't know. I can only speak from my own perspective. The Cuban Solidarity Movement has been active enough in the past, and still is active, but it's been active enough in the past that I've allowed myself to watch it, and participate every once in a while, from a distance. And I think many people who I engage with have felt the same way. We're in our silo working, and we're going to work over here. And every once in a while, we'll stretch over. But I think what we're talking about now, we're talking about the immorality of, and I'm not going to advocate not paying taxes. I have my own issue with paying taxes. But the point is, I am witnessing my money being used to starve people to death, literally to dehumanize people around the world. And so many people in my circle have expressed the same things. So for myself, it's like kicking in that other burner that I had, taking on more and committing myself. And I'm speaking for people in my circle, I'm not just speaking of myself. I think that the solidarity movement will be re-energized and expanded because of what we're confronting now. And you have to really be a person without soul. You have to be a person without morality, I think, to witness what's being done in Cuba. And then you have to recognize that it's connected to how the United States is operating all over the world. I don't think there's much of a difference between this and Gaza, except the bombing and except the acting of the state of Israel engaged in what they're engaged in over there. The fact of the matter is, this is an issue for people to take on, and I think, from the response I've seen, that Cuban solidarity movement will be enhanced and expanded, and a true battle has just begun. That's from my perspective.
Thank you for this question specifically about solidarity, and I want to name a couple of things. You talked about tactics. One thing I think about tactics is that folks are recognizing what what they did there, we could do here, which shows that there are some interconnections between what is actually happening across communities, rather than things happening in silos or in distinct ways. So by sharing tactics like flotillas, like sharing material aid, these are things that we can apply in different areas and then connect the struggle because we can share those tactics. Another thing is about identifying common perpetrators or common enemies. And especially in a technology age, this is becoming even more apparent. The same technologies that are being used to surveil and shoot people in Gaza are the same technologies in our very neighborhoods here in the US that are being used to criminalize our neighbors. They're the same technologies that are being exported to other places to repress. So by identifying these common perpetrators, we're able to share our struggle because then we have a common fight there too, even if it looks different in how it's being used. There are also different things that people are recognizing. There are specific cultural strategies that are part of imperialism too. One thing about Cuban culture is that it's very cultural. Music is essential to liberation. Art is essential to history making and history keeping. So by identifying the ways that our cultures are being attacked and being diminished, that's also a common fight that people are seeing globally. So I appreciate this question, but it's one that I think that it's so many different things. The ability to connect with our lives and our struggles, our paths, our perpetrators, and then connect to our futures that we want to collectively see. We all want a healthier earth. We all want access to education. We all want access to housing. Those are common futures that we can move towards too. So I do think that there is a more of a solidarity movement because we're able to better connect our past through things like political education. We're able to better connect our presence through things like identifying what is impacting our lives every day now. Then we're better able to connect our futures because we want the same things.
Can I just say one other thing? And this is directly to your point. I came back, I came back to DC on Saturday. I was sitting on the bed and I'm going over everything. And I'm in tears. And I'm sharing this with the frustration and just thinking of the work that had to be done. I'm sharing this because I just spoke to you about silos and it occurred to me. One of my mentors, who's been in the struggle longer than me, while I'm sitting there and I'm in tears, he calls me and he's in tears. He also works in silos that are not just generally identified with Cuba, but empathetic. And the first words out of his mouth, he didn't say, well, I'm glad you're back. He didn't say, I didn't know you were back. He says they're killing the people of Cuba. We've got to do something. We've got to do something. And that's what I'm speaking of when I'm talking about the silos coming together. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm saying people that I know are moving from their silos and moving to expand their activities inside the movement that's been endured.
I'm James Harris, DC Metro Coalition. One of the things I think is very necessary are more public, I congratulate everybody for being here, because this is what we need, but more public actions in defense of Cuba that begin to get out the actual truth of what is taking place, aimed at the population as a whole, in terms of, some demonstrations to begin to take place, physical demonstrations. There is, I know that the material aid is extremely important, but at the same time, what is extremely important is informing the population in this country, working people in general in this country, that are fed continual lies about the Cuban Revolution, what it has achieved, and why they should support it. Even small actions, sometimes get picked up by the press. I know sometimes they get picked up in Cuba to give the Cuban people the idea that there is solidarity in this country. And we should, as much as possible, try to expand upon that sentiment, because people, all they get about Cuba is lies. they don't know what Cuba has done. So all of you who are from different groups and different organizations, we have to figure out how to come together and start doing bigger things. Not just, but bigger things in this country to show our support for Cuba and what Cuba has achieved in the world through the Cuban Revolution. But anyway, this is a good start.
Well, we have to be out of this room by 2 o'clock, and I'm not opposed to continuing the discussion, but it seems like people are into making comments now, and there aren't. Are there any questions for any of the panelists?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
Esther. Yeah. I'm sorry to identify myself before. Esther Rivera from Pacifica Radio and Breakthrough News. I have a question about the legal case. I'm thinking about the case of Stephen Donziger and his attempt to defend the people in the Amazon against the depredations of the oil giants there, and wondering if that case and what the courts did and did not do would have any bearing on what the Supreme Court, how the Supreme Court hears this case and handles it.
I can speak briefly to the Donziger case. I do not know or wouldn't have the legal expertise to connect that to the ongoing case here. Hopefully one of the other panelists may be able to. A few things that really made the Donziger case stand out is it was a private criminal prosecution, which is extremely unusual. Usually, a criminal case is brought by the state. It's brought by a prosecutor who is a public official. And private individuals or entities can only bring civil lawsuits, right? Apparently, there is some provision that in some exceptions allows private entities to bring criminal lawsuits. That's what happened in the Donziger case, where Chevron brought criminal charges on their own, not going through like a U.S. attorney, against Donziger for alleged corruption. And observers from around the world have said that it was a starkly unfair trial where the judge had actual connections with the law firm that was representing Chevron, which was Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, which is, they're almost like a comic book villain. They are often involved in like any number of lawsuits defending bad guys. You will find Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher as the attorneys representing this big corporation. So anyway, they filed criminal charges against Donziger, and he was sentenced to imprisonment. And implicitly, what they were also doing was saying that a court's decision in a sovereign foreign country, a case that went all the way to the Supreme Court in Ecuador, was not valid, and US courts would not recognize that. And it's a stark example of both the thing I was referring to earlier in my comments about how the legal system is stacked in favor of corporations, and it's also a glaring example of imperialism, of how the United States does not recognize the sovereignty of sovereign countries.
not too familiar with the Dodge case, which is why I hesitated to get up. But one of the implications of the Exxon case that's being heard today is that I guess we have to go way back. So Exxon had some service stations and refineries in Cuba that were expropriated in the early years of Cuba's new revolutionary government. They essentially, at Washington's orders, refused to refine Soviet crude oil at a time that Cuba really needed to be able to refine oil. But a connection that it may have to the Donziger case, though it's not a criminal one, in order to take civil action against foreign government or foreign companies, there's something called the Foreign Sovereign Immunity Act, and there's a list of exceptions that you have to meet in order to continue with the suit. Lower courts ruled that Exxon did not meet any of the exceptions, and this is why it's now the Supreme Court. So one of the implications they could have, unlike where the U.S. courts aren't recognizing an Ecuadorian criminal ruling, the United States is looking to bring action against a Cuban state-owned conglomerate. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm sure, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I have two questions. I'm Elijah. I'm a reporter. Elijah Pittman, a reporter at Howard University right now. I'm working with HEU service. The first question I have is kind of a starter reporter question. Can I just get everybody's name spelled out just so it's easy to quote?
Cheryl, do you have a sheet?
Or just a sheet, yeah, that's
Yeah.
That would be great, the press release. Okay, cool. My second question, which is a little bit more content-based. How do we build a culture of collectivism and solidarity first in a city where people are already facing so many conditions that the Cuban people are facing, and then B, how do we build an international culture of collectivism and solidarity from the bottom up when those people are also facing the same global conditions that Cuba's facing? I don't know who to answer, but it's not that
I mean, so I'm on a long time like solidarity activists, and one of the things that's really giving me hope in the last not just year or so, but beyond that, is that more and more people are drawing those connections between imperialism abroad and militarism here at home, and how that affects all of us, whether it's black people being shot by the police, or migrants being kidnapped off the streets, or now just everyday people being killed by ICE for reporting. And I think that the more we do that, we can tie those connections together and talk about the fact that we have $1 trillion Pentagon budget. I think it was an article just the other day where the Pentagon said that they didn't even know what to do with $500 million they got. I have ideas of what they could do with that. They could invest in education and health and clean water. So the more we talk about those ideas, and the more we talk to each other across our different movements, is how we build them together, to have one unified voice against not just imperialism, but this whole system, which is really part and parcel of imperialism, of course, but not just imperialism abroad, but everything that's going on here. And in terms of international solidarity, you know, when we look at Cuba, Cuba's the example of international solidarity, right? It started, I mean, I don't know where you want to start, but obviously thinking of their role in fighting apartheid South Africa. And I just want to mention briefly that one of the men who died in Venezuela was another Cubans who died in Venezuela, was a man who received a battlefield commission in Angola, fighting against South Africans. And then he went back to Cuba and went to the military there and got his degrees and was a big part of Cuba's security apparatus for a long time. And he provided security to the 3 popes, and then he was killed by U.S. forces. And why was he in Venezuela? He was in Venezuela as an act of solidarity. And I think we really have to highlight Cuba's international solidarity with the medical missions as well. And they've served as a huge inspiration, not just to people in the United States, people all over the world look to Cuba as a symbol of hope. And I think the more we talk about how people, not just in Cuba, because it goes beyond that now, of how we're building solidarity across borders, I think that's incredibly important to uplift those stories, to inspire us, because we're bombarded every day with things that are just devastating, right? We see the genocide live streamed on Twitter and other apps, and that's horrifying. But at the same time, we have to understand that there's people all over the world fighting against these same forces.
people in Cuba, people in Burkina Faso, people in Mali, people in Venezuela. And it was an international solidarity call with people in the US too, talking about these common enemies and how we can work together as folks. It was both highlighting the histories that we have between our people, but also the futures that we're building together. So that's a big piece of international solidarity, is talking to each other. And that can be hard. Like, this is a small meeting and we had 3 languages present, we had translation, and that takes investment in time, but that's what we have to do. We have to take the investment in time to not take the easy road to talk to people who we have access to, but also the people that we don't have as much access to. But one of the things that connects all of these global fights is working class people. So when we're thinking about solidarity across borders, what we have in common is that the mass majority of people are working class. The mass majority of people are looking to get their basic needs met. So when we rally around a movement around working people, then we rally around a global movement. And that's something that can connect here to DC too. Especially when we think about things like DC and Cuba. DC is not a state. We can talk about how DC is an occupied land without representation, who has been extracted from. We can talk about how Black people in DC have been under similar conditions as people in Cuba because of the lack of investment in our communities. So making those direct connections is something that's important too. I think a lot about this term, again, I'm just talking quick because we all gotta go. But it was a term that really solidified a lot of actions in the 60s and 70s and in the Black Panther Party. It said, think globally, act globally. And it made us think exactly about that we can't think about our situations and our struggles in isolation. We have to think about the global struggle, but thinking about the global struggle doesn't mean just fighting at the global level. We have to implement it every day in our everyday lives too.
To end this press conference on, I want to thank all of the panelists, and I want to thank all of the organizations, the Methodist Church Center, the Claudia Jones School, Struggle for Socialism, the DC U.S. Cuba Normalization Committee, the Dorothy Day Catholic Worker, the Friends of Latin America, who had to leave, as part of Sanctions Kill, and really everyone who helped to make this a tremendous success. The video is available on the National Network on Cuba's Facebook page. Please look at it, share it. Ermia was doing some shorts, so there's going to be more up on social media. And hopefully we come out of this meeting working more closely together